Welcome everyone. My name is George Warren. I'm hosting the panel today. I'm a coach and supervisor, and I'm a member of the faculty here at the AWEC. And well, about 2 years ago today, I joined a webinar just like this, which helped me find my own strengths and my own way forward in the climate crisis. And since then, I've been on a wonderful journey, which has involved doing a lot of coaching around the subject, and in fact, creating a course for the AWEC, Coaching in the Climate Crisis, as well as hosting a podcast series. So it's a very special day for me today. By way of setting us up, we've got Vicky from the team as in a sort of support role. So any admin technical questions, please let her know. We've got the chat function, and we've also got a Q&A. So any questions you've got for Tabitha, Peter, and Linda, please drop them in the Q&A. And yeah, I think what would be helpful would be to get going by, well, first of all, letting you know that this is recorded, but also if you want to use the chat function, maybe drop a few messages in there about what's getting in the way of you having better conversations around climate change and climate crisis. What's stopping you? Whether you're a coach or not, what's stopping you from talking about this more? Please speak freely. And while you do that, let me introduce Tabitha, Jane, Peter Hawkins, and Linda Aspey, who will be our co-panelists today. Welcome to you all.
Good to be here.
Good to be here, yeah.
Nice group to have this discussion with, and with everyone who's online.
Thank you. I think there's two things that I also wanted to say before we get into it. One is which I think it's important, certainly for me, front of mind, to acknowledge the horror and atrocity that's taking place in Ukraine at the moment, and also honor the courage and determination of the Ukrainian people. And as well, I especially want to dedicate this conversation to a lady called Alison Wybrow, who was a psychologist and coach and the founder of the Climate Coaching Alliance. She passed away a few days ago, and it's no understatement to say that her work has influenced thousands of coaches, and she's influenced me a lot. I owe her a great deal, and many of us will miss her very much.
Absolutely, she was a great pioneer in this whole area of climate conscious coaching.
Hugely.
And will be missed by many.
Yeah.
Thank you. So today's conversation is framed around climate anxiety and environmental psychology. And I think what might be really helpful would be to just try and get some words out there about what we mean when we speak about eco-anxiety or climate anxiety. Linda, perhaps we could hear your thoughts on that first.
Sure. Well, it's a term, it's a bit of a catch-all term that refers to the feeling of impending doom that some people have, and all the concerns and the fears they have and the stress they have about what's happening to our world. And it's an issue actually caused by much wider systemic issues than just climate. It's about the environment, it's about our society, it's about the life we live. But climate and environmental destruction are one of those symptoms of it. So it's about that feeling of malaise that people have. And there are varying degrees of it. And I just want to very clearly say right at the start that there are many who believe that climate anxiety in the global north is a bit of a luxury because we are anxious about things that haven't yet happened, where there are people all over the world, particularly people of colour, BIPOC communities that are already impacted, and they've kind of gone past anxiety. They're into managing the daily impacts and the traumas of that. So whilst I'm not saying we are privileged to have it, I think we just need to acknowledge that it's something that we're all living with and increasingly are going to be confronting on various different levels.
Thank you. And Tabitha, what's been your experience of that coming into some of the conversations you've been having?
So my experience, I started coaching with nature, not climate, and I've been doing that for over a decade. And For me, there's this huge difference between climate and nature. And when I first started coaching with nature, the conversations were more about nature, the connection, the beauty and the magic. But what I'm noticing, especially in the last 2-3 years, is that climate is starting to dominate the conversation in terms of what nature means. And if I think back to a project that I ran last year where I was experimenting in terms of how to create a connection to Earth online. Now, Earth is a big word, like climate as well. But what was really fascinating sitting in all the pilot sessions that the coaches were running, because I did tech so that I could observe, was the amount of times that climate would start coming into the conversation. And it's like, ooh, it's overshadowing. And the conversations about what are we doing or being unable to express emotions is coming more and more up into the front and almost being a sticking point. And out of one of the sessions that we ran, there's something that still sits and replays in my head, which brings me back to the nature, where there was a young man who'd taken part in this session that was connecting to Earth and gone through this process. And afterwards he said to me, I have been so depressed about climate and I am deciding I'm not going to get depressed anymore because I love nature. And you've just reminded me that that's what's important. And that's what I want to take care of. I don't want to focus on climate because it's too scary, but I can take care of nature. So it's that tension between, with this impending doom, you know, and because as you said, Linda, the whole systemic issues that are actually there, it's not just climate, it's all the interconnections that are going on. How do we bring it back to the beauty, the meaning and the awe? Because that's what creates the connection and that's what inspires the action. And that for me is a challenge. I think I am seeing more and more with all the core conversations that I'm having with coaches and non-coaches.
Thanks, Tabitha. Peter, I'm wondering if that's sparked anything you wanted to share.
Yes, I feel very close to what you both shared. And as you were talking, Tabitha, I was thinking that what you were sharing was quite close to what Arnie Ness, the founder of Deep Ecology, talked about. He said, look, that the real issue is our feeling of separation from nature, that nature is other than us, rather than something that we are part of and flows through us and is within us. He said, if we actually can heal that, then we naturally take care of what is us and we are part of. You know, we take care of our family, we take care of our community. And it's that making it other that is so damaging. But I was thinking, you know, when you were talking, Linda, the thing about eco-anxiety, there's been lots written about it, including the psychology and psychiatry fields. And there's been some very interesting research on the massive upsurge in young people and how it's entering the dreams, it's entering it's turning up in adolescent psychiatric consulting rooms, it's turning up in dreams. And I think we can think about it in terms of both, there's the grief of what we've lost, the grief for species that have disappeared, the grief for ecological niches that are disappearing, islands, as you talked about, Linda, in the global south that are already going underwater. And that deep sense of, there's also that future loss, that fear of what won't be there for children and grandchildren. And that feelings that come with it of anger, you know, the whole grief cycle of anger and guilt, rage, grief, and then overwhelm. And that, now how do we hold, and I liked what you said, Tabitha, how do we hold both the grief and despair and the hope? How do we hold those not as separate things we swing between, but things that need to be united together?
Thanks, Peter. And you know, reading a few comments there, what's great to hear is that in so many of your answers already, we're speaking to those things. You know, Gemma mentioned it's just so big, overwhelm, confidence is stopping me. So, you know, this being a conversation framed around coaching and coaches. I guess the question that I wanted to offer to all of you would be, what can we do as coaches and how can we do it? Linda, would you like to start? Oh, you're on mute.
I think the one important thing is that we don't pathologize it, that it's a very, very normal, understandable and human response to the life that we know and the life that we anticipated. So in a way, one could say it's slightly not normal to be ignorant of it and to not have any form of climate anxiety, although we've been doing a very good job at pushing it away a lot of the time and using defense processes to mask how we feel, which maybe will come up later on in the conversation. But I think it's so important that we don't talk about treating it, that we actually talk about working with it and supporting people through it. It's not something that should ever be pathologized. And working with it, of course, it shows itself in a variety of ways, just like any loss, anticipated or actual. And that can be from feelings of helplessness, it can be numb, it can be shock, it can be denial. It can be, in my case, it was manic defensive activity, keep busy, keep absolutely busy. And for some people, it's a gradual thing. So sometimes when I'm coaching people, they've been aware, as I was for a long time, that the world wasn't right and we weren't heading in the right direction. But as coaches, I think we also need to be prepared for people having massive climate awakenings. I had one of those as well. And that climate awakening put me into a state of distress for several weeks, where everything I saw looked darker than it could possibly be at the time. Everywhere I looked was destruction. And so I think for coaches to be ready to work with a massive range of responses that aren't necessarily fixed either, just like any grief or anticipated loss, which is in itself a form of grief, we go in and out of different things. And I think as coaches, equipping ourselves, first of all, by doing the work on ourselves, which is so important, to do the work on ourselves and get fantastic supervision before we even dream of working with clients on it, because we've got to be safe containers. This is an unusual situation. If you were coaching somebody who told you they'd been bereaved, if you were bereaved yourself and felt unable to coach for a while, you could take time out, hopefully, with some good support. So I'm not going to be coaching for a while. I'm going to look after myself. And you certainly might avoid taking on clients who you knew had bereavement that they were working with in the background. And I'm not talking necessarily about therapeutic work, just talking about the stuff of life. With climate change and everything that's going with it, we are all part of this. We're all in it. We're all experiencing it. We've got kids, nephews, grandchildren, family, wherever, we've got things happening. So there is a difference here, that the separation is less easy and the compartmentalization might be less easy. Hence, I think the really good work on ourselves to be prepared for a range of responses, both in our clients and the groups we work with, individuals and groups, and also in ourselves, because this is an ongoing process of assimilation. This isn't a one-off event. It's going to be a cascading series of events that impact us with more news and more closeness and more hope as well. I'm not saying it's all doom and gloom. So I think that ongoing process of self-care, self-reflection, and working on ourselves so we can do good work with others, I think particularly pertinent to coaching and of course to counselling and psychotherapy. And they're just beginning to wake up, and they haven't been awake for a very long time on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. And I'd like to come back to the role of hope and all that brings in a little while. But so Tabitha, one of the themes of the conversation so far sounds to be about connecting with the natural in us and the fact that we're all of nature. And that there was a comment in the chat about it's all very well if you live in the countryside to go out for a walk in nature and admire the forest. But I'm curious, and perhaps Peter as well, we can hear your thoughts on this after. If you're coaching someone over Zoom who's in an apartment in Hong Kong or New York, how might you help them connect with nature and the natural and the environment?
And I'm glad that you bring that question in, because Again, it's a very Western perspective that we can go for a walk and be surrounded in nature. And the wider that I speak in terms of conversations, the more people that go, but it's not safe for me to leave the park or leave the house. I can't go out because the park is filled with drug addicts. There's a war going on. Nature's being destroyed. And it has to bring it back to really simple techniques. But I think without getting too much into the evidence base, there's simple techniques that, you know, for me, I mean, this looks great, you know, on screen, here's a running water scene. But actually, the purpose of this is it's sensory techniques, because what the evidence base is showing and what happens when you're actually working with people with nature, you need to be noticing it, so it becomes that mindfulness and that active way. I also want to just build upon what Patrick's saying in there of connecting with nature can just be another way of consuming nature. We have to bring it in to notice nature, to become the sensory awareness of it. And we need to move into processing the emotions to turn it into action. So if I go back to, and I'm going slightly off topic here, but it's all relevant in the context of the research project that I ran last year, which was how can you create a sense of connection to Earth online? And there was one group dynamic that was really, really fascinating, where the conversation went, instead of connecting to talk about beauty, it went into, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing. And it actually became a virtue signaling conversation. What was underneath as we digested it was the grief that's not acknowledged. And as Linda says, it has to be given time gently to explore. That's where working in a virtual setting, we can talk about the grief online really, really importantly, because if that's not acknowledged, how can we then talk about the action that needs to happen? And then people come into, this is what I'm doing, or people start running away from it. And then they're not noticing nature, but it builds the point of what Peter was saying. There's no separation. If the emotions are present in our body, if we're noticing nature out with, we also have to notice what's going on internally, because we are part of nature. And that dynamic interplay of what's happening, even between the coach and client, you know, the coach is nature, the client is nature. What's happening in that space there as well? All of it is nature at play, but we've been trained to create that separation, you know. And Peter, you say something which I love, which is the ecology is always in the room. Nature, Earth is in the room right now through every single breath that everybody's taking. So narrowing it into this narrow definition of nature as an inanimate object externally from us on a screen or outside a window is missing the whole point of the conversation of how we work with it. And it's only by working with that bigger definition and recognizing that the whole point that underlies nature connection, environmental psychology, all the different definitions is it's the connection to nature that makes us want to take the right action. And that's the missing piece. And it's the emotions that catalyze into hope. And then it comes into a feedback loop.
So just to build on that, Tabitha, perhaps we should go even further and say we should talk about connecting to nature, because even that makes it other, but opening more fully to the nature that we are part of. Because the whole construct of nature and culture, which was an 18th century Western white construct, and we're still caught, so much of our language is still caught in that, in the West with that, in the North with that kind of way of thinking. And so to go back to your very practical question, George, there is something about whether we're in an apartment in a tower block, or whether we're, I'm fortunate enough to look at on beautiful full countryside. There is something about how does the ecology, and I like that word because in some ways more, because the ecology, we are part of it. We're nested in with many ecological systems that we are part of. And every system we're part of is also part of us. But how do we give that a more fuller voice? So how do we have in the coaching room, not just the coach of the individual, but the voice of their customers, their teams, their community, and the voice of the more than human world. And I always use that term because it includes us, and yet it is more than us. And how do we let that voice be present and have that voice that both the coachee and the coach are listening to as it appears through and within us, as well as outside of us? And, you know, many people on this call will be trained in Gestalt techniques. And, you know, do you have a chair for the more than human world in your coaching room?
Sorry.
Oh, there's John Leary Joyce. Welcome.
Sorry, I'm late.
Hi, John. Would you mind switching off your video? Thanks. Welcome, by the way.
So it's like, how do we? And I think that the biggest challenge with eco-anxiety is people who are actually experiencing it but can't bear it, and therefore go into a denial, like you talked about, Linda, as reaction to overwhelm. Yeah, and so I think we have a responsibility, and I'm totally with you about doing our own work to grow our capacity to stay within hold, but also need ways of working with denial as one of the symptoms, right, of the eco-anxiety cycle, which I write about in the book I did with Eve Turner. We talk about the emotional cycle that built on all the work around the greed cycle and the change cycle that we go through around the ecology. And I think that working with, you know, I'd be very interested to hear, Linda and Tabitha, your thoughts on that. But how do we work respectively and with compassion with someone who is both in eco-anxiety and in denial at the same time? Because then we can be holding the feelings that they're feeling, but denying. And that's where then there's some tricky work to be done.
So what I'd really like to hear both of your thoughts, Tabitha and Linda, and my angle coming in is as well, not the individual we're working with, but perhaps the team or organization as well that might be in denial about this.
Absolutely. Shall I go first, or Tabitha?
Please go first, Linda.
Thanks. Well, both what you've both said about, you know, in the room, nature in the room, and we've ignored that for a long time because we've become addicted to other kinds of things. We used to be naturally addicted to nature and everything to the rest of nature. We're now addicted to other things in its place. And it strikes me that we've been struggling for a long time to fill that void, and we've been filling it with stuff and busyness and business as usual and things like that. But I love the idea, Peter, of becoming more fully open to nature, fully open, because there's something of an obsession, understandable, of this fear of bringing it into the room as coaches and working with those kind of, you know, if you think for a moment, I'm going to have to take this into a room where someone's in denial, or it might upset them, who's going to want to do that? It's just not a very inviting prospect. And I think it conjures up terror in the minds of coaches who think that we're going to have to grab people around the throat and say, we need to talk about climate change. But of course, it doesn't have to be like that. I think one thing that's really important is that one of our roles as coaches is to widen the lens of awareness and widen the window of tolerance for what's happening in their lives and in our world. So if we're not widening windows, what are we doing? And we might be, yes, there's that idea of colluding in silence, but how we introduce denial, how we introduce all those feelings about it in the coaching context or in any other context is, first of all, I think, to recognize in ourselves that we're in denial a lot of the time anyway. I often use this example. Last summer, I went into the local town and I saw a really nice linen dress in the window, and I just was about to go in and buy it. And I just thought, Linda, you've got 3 dresses you hardly wear. what are you doing? This is business as usual. You're just trying to kid yourself that life can go on as it did. And of course it can't. We've got to reduce our consumption by 50% in the parts of the world that are doing the harm. So I think recognizing that denial is a very normal response to any form of change that might be coming our way, and all the defenses that can come with that. There's distancing, pushing it away. It's not here, it's over there. It's those poor people, it's not me. The kind of language we've been hearing in the media recently around the war, around, at least we can recognize these people because they're white and they look like us and they drive cars like us. Whereas it's harder to believe that it's happening to Ukrainians rather than it is to Iraqis or Afghanistans. It's just amazing, mind-blowing. But that's the system that many are living in. So I think our role as coaches is to recognize it in ourselves and learn how to overcome that and really exercise compassion. That doesn't mean to say letting ourselves off the hook. I think it just means saying, I've done this and I'm recognizing it and I'm going to take steps to address this, and recognizing that compassion, using compassion with others, because it's highly likely that 5 years ago, before I had my climate awakening, I was completely in denial of what was going on in the world. I chose not to look at it. So if I'm going to beat somebody up for not thinking about it now, just because I've chosen to, I'm not going to get very far with them, and they're not going to get very far either. So I think we need to be invitational. We need to be respectful. We need to say, and I think it starts, I can go on about this a bit more, but it starts from the moment the client hears of us or sees us online. It's what we say, what we do, how we show up in every interaction that lets people know that this is an issue that we work with, that we're open to. And I think once we let people know that we are a window they can come to, then it reduces their anxiety about what they're going to bring. But if we don't create the right space in the first place, that they know even before they've opened their mouth, that they're going to be safe to talk about the difficult stuff that society is currently constraining them from talking about, which might be racism, which might be gender, which might be all sorts of things. It might be all sorts of oppression. It's not just climate. So I think it goes into how we show up in the world, even before they interact with us personally.
I just wanted to come in just briefly, so if that's okay, Tabitha. I'll pass back to you. There's if a coachee, we wouldn't ask how do we bring a coachee's body into the coaching room. We'd think that's a strange notion. They bring their own body in. They bring their own ecology in. And I, as you were talking, I was kind of thinking about that and thinking, if we did have a coachee who was denying that they had a body, then we would work with that as a aberration. That somehow, if somebody denies they're part of an ecology, one of the things, we have the notion that that is an aberration, right? And I like what you're saying about respectfully, but there is something about how, and that widening the perspective. So how do we, and part of that is, I think we have to recognize that coaching has become very anthropocentric and very individualistic and very focusing on individual needs and wants. So I think we have to really kind of work at some of the fundamental beliefs of coaching, as well as some of the Northern Hemisphere white Western paradigms. Because it's no good just working on our emotional stuff that we have to deal with to work ecology. We have to work on some of our whole ways of thinking that are embedded in coaching competencies and coach training. So I just, sorry to jump in there, Tabitha, but I just wanted to share that.
No, because I think it's important. Do you want to finish what you were saying first, Linda?
No, I did. No, I had finished, but
okay,
I really resonate with what you've just said there, Peter.
Yeah, so I mean, there's two things there that are really alive in the conversation. One is meeting people where they're at, and this is especially important as we look at how we evolve coaching and make it fit for the 21st century, is what you're talking about there, Peter. And I always find that it's easier to meet people where they are and have the honest conversations. I mean, I've had people who've come to me and said, does it matter that I don't even believe that climate change is real? I've said, no. You can sit in that perspective if you want, but the practical, tangible bit is we still need to coach your business around the fact that there's changing legislation. It's going to impact your market. The ESG points are coming in. Let's look at it practically. That still creates a space where, for me, there's an entry point into conversations where I'm not challenging their denial. I'm creating that safe space, as Linda talked about. And looking at what coaching is and where it goes, for me, is a huge part of this, Peter. So I'm really glad that you've said it, because I come from a very working class background, very marginalized. So I've kind of like stepped up, and in coaching, I've kind of had my eyes open to, wow, this seems really middle class and privileged. And I don't mean that in disrespectful to anybody who's there, but the conversation that people will have, you know, for the last 5 years, I've been coaching my family to get the social services involved because there's been issues within the family dynamics and everything else, and using the skills in that way, or working with people who are doing community projects. It's a very different approach for coaching that you bring in there. And while I appreciate the guidelines, I recognize there does need to be this change, because how are we making sure that coaching, you know, I see so much of coaching talking about, let's come in and get the leadership on board to actually change things and then actually move it through. How do we actually shift focus and do it from the ground up? Because one of the things that I love the most in any organizations that I work with, or even in projects that I'm involved with, I go and I speak to the people who are closest to the ground. And what I mean by closest to the ground is it's the people at the bottom. They'll tell you everything that's going on, and giving them a voice when they've never had a voice. That, for me, is the powerful part of coaching, and where coaching can really evolve in the 21st century, so that we've got this democratization of coaching being freely available to everybody. And I experiment with my family in many different ways because, you know, my family and I love them. So to give you an example, I'm talking about this project that I did. I challenged myself to coach my 13-year-old niece. She got involved in the project. It was funded. The only way I could get her in, by the way, was meeting her where she was, and I paid her. She wasn't interested in nature and earth and climate. She was interested in money. So I met her where she was. She was too shy to come into the room, holding up a little whiteboard, going, oh, okay, this is me, this is my name, switching the camera off and hiding. And simply by using coaching skills in that context with my 13-year-old niece, which was even more challenging because the family system is sitting within me as I'm having the conversations and the dynamics are playing out, my niece went from too shy to, in 4 months, co-facilitating a session of a debrief with other facilitators. So it wasn't quite coaching, it was more facilitating. But the feedback that she then got off her authenticity, and we talked about it, and I said, can you believe that you're getting paid to be yourself? And she went, no. I said, can you believe that people are listening to you and thinking about how they're going to change the conversations that they're having with education providers because of what you've said in this room? It's like, no. And that's the beautiful space where, for me, coaching can go in the climate crisis of, let's meet people where we are, let's move from the top-down approach into the community approaches and really empower the people who don't have the voice to be able to find and express themselves. And that space that we create as coaches for people to be truly heard and witnessed, I think is one of the most beautiful spaces. And it allows us to actually help evolve these, especially the next generation, who are feeling a huge amount of responsibility. As you've talked about, Peter, the eco-anxiety is coming in. So you've got the people who are not interested, disengaged, and then the people who are engaged, who are in complete anxiety because they're also being told that they can get jobs, but then there's no jobs when they come out in the market. And that's another conversation, coaching conversation I'm having just now, of navigating that. So I think the point that I'm saying is to kind of summarize that and kind of close it off. It is meeting where people where they are and absolutely redefining where we put our energy and focus as coaches. And For me, it's not necessarily saying I'm a climate coach and I can coach you on climate. It's maybe making a decision in our coaching practice to work with different people in different ways and in contexts that we might not have seen. Because if all we view coaching as the traditional pathway, coaching as a profession isn't going to evolve, neither are we, and neither is the future collective that's sitting there waiting to be included in the conversation, the wider system, and be brought back to say, hey, this is really what the voice of everything that's important has been said.
Could I just build on that, Tabitha? Because I wonder that even the notion that we have to start where the individual is, which is slightly different than what you were saying, is a very human-centric, individualistic-centric, white northern concept. In many cultures, the notion that an individual is separate from their community would not make sense. And I think part of one of the things, which I'm totally with you on, the subtitle of the book I did with Eve Turner on systemic coaching was delivering, how do we move beyond individual coaching being very expensive personal development for the already highly privileged. And I absolutely with you that we've got to both democratize in terms of who it's for, but also I think we have to move further than that, and we have to recognize that in some ways coaching has been part of a Anglo-American cultural colonization. And part of that is to colonize the individual as the arbiter of what's needed. So I no longer ask people what they want in coaching. Yes, I think we have to come alongside them, but not facing them, but shoulder to shoulder with them and facing what their world is asking of them. I think we have to stop seeing individuals as customers and us as suppliers. I think we've got to be privileging what the world is needing, not what the individual coachee is needing. And without that, I think we don't have the time, I don't think, for the ecological crisis to try and help people change one person at a time. That notion of, when I work with people now, I'm interested in finding out about them, but very quickly I'm interested in asking, who and what does your life serve? And then who else? And who beyond your organization? And who beyond the current generation? And who beyond the human world? Right? Because that naturally opens us up to the fact that we are part of so many levels. And I think all of those have to have an equal voice in the room as the individual. Yeah. And that's why I think we have to radically rethink coaching beyond what I think is still an offshoot of individualistic, white, Anglo-American, human-centric concepts.
Can I build on that, Peter? When Peter and I were in the early days, when coaching first came into the UK, we were both probably still operating more in the psychotherapeutic and supervisory field. And at that time, coaching was very much portrayed as something for very successful people who just wanted to be more successful, and as therapy for dysfunctional people who just wanted to stop being dysfunctional. And of course, we realized that's actually not the reality at all. But coaching was very much seen as something of great privilege, and with higher fees associated with that, and everything else that went with it. So it sort of came in from this position of, there's nothing wrong with you, we just need to make you more successful. So I think it started off on quite an unhealthy footing in the way that it was imported. Whereas if we perhaps at that time looked to see how do other cultures around the world help people to to grow, to generate, to develop better, to have relationship, to be in relationship with. We were probably asking the wrong questions at the time because we were caught up in the industrial growth society, which told us that more is better, that that we didn't have enough and we needed to get more, and that we needed to be the best version of ourselves. It's an expression I loathe. I think we should be the best version of the world that we could possibly be, but not of ourselves. But again, building on Peter's thoughts there about the individualistic side of things, Grattan's asked a really good question in the chat box, which Grattan and I often talk about this, is the lens of climate is just so narrow. And Peter's talking about widening the lens, widening the window for people. This is not just about climate change or even ecological decline. These are symptoms of a society and a world in great malaise. And how do we widen our own lenses? And how do we bring awareness of the system that's already there much more into the conversations we have and the way we have them? And just one final thing about individuals. People are motivated by their values, and if we look at the values of this current growth dominant, GDP dominant world, then those values are not consistent with a life sustaining society. So for me and for many others that I talk with, it's about a fundamental shift before it's too late, and it's already too late for a lot of people, in how we think about life, how we think about the world, how we think about others, and how we think about our role within this wider system. Because if we don't shift fundamentally in our values, then we're not going to get anywhere, coaching room or not.
I just seeing a comment from Patrick Hobbs in the chat box, which I just want to quickly come back on, where Patrick says a system could also be destructive, which I totally agree with. But I think we need to distinguish between talk about systems and talk about systemic, because any part of the totality of life on Earth that tries to sub-optimize itself, whether that's an organization, whether it's a family, whether it's an individual, whether it's a species, absolutely, if they sub-optimize themselves at the cost of their ecological niche, they are destructive and ultimately destructive to themselves, right? It's one of the things that Gregory Bateson talked about for many years. And I love what you said. We met years back, but before I got into coaching in the late 70s, early 1980s, I was in mental health. In those days, one of the things that was very obvious is that if you had mental health issues and you were poor, you went to prison. If you were mental health issues and you were middle class, you ended up in psychiatric hospital. And if you were mental health issues and you were rich, you went off and had psychotherapy. And all we've done is added another layer to that and if you're very privileged, you get coaching, which means you don't even pay for your psychotherapy yourself. So I think there is something about, but I just wanted to mention the thing with Patrick, that notion that we have to look at, because I think even in coaching, and a lot of people I supervise as coaches, we are in danger constantly of helping the individual win out against their wider systemic ecosystems that they're part of. And that is not good for the individual or the ecosystems they're part of. It's ultimately destructive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Peter. And I'm looking at the watch. We're into our sort of last quarter of the conversation. I know, Peter, you have to drop off a few minutes early. So what I want to ask is, I'm aware we've got 60 odd people that are interested in coaching, maybe coaches themselves here, more on the recording. I feel like we've opened up our awareness to the systemic and the ecosystemic. And we've also opened it up wider than the climate crisis, which is a symptom of a wider malaise and wider problems. We spoke in the chat, we heard about people speaking about overwhelm, not knowing where to start. We've got coaches on the call. How can we what would you like to say to them to start after they've done the work on themselves, after they've maybe worked with a supervisor? What would you like to say to start the how of really taking action to this and bringing it into their coaching work? Tabitha, any thoughts sparking there?
I'd like more time to think.
If I start off, because I should be leaving early, just say I think the first thing I would be encouraging, and doing this book with Eve Turner and it was with Alison Wybrow, who has contributed a lot to the book, and Josie McLean, and where we're looking at ecological and climate conscious coaching. And in that, in a whole bit on eco-engaged coaching, one of the things we're encouraging is that you stop thinking of yourself as doing the coaching. Right? You see the other person is not your client and you the supplier, but you're there as coaching partners. And that you're both in service of all the worlds that the coachee is part of. Yeah. And I think once we start there and we bring the voice of the other into the room, the voice of their customers, their colleagues, their employees, their stakeholders, their communities in which the organization operates, the wider community, and the ecology. Once we do it, it becomes a very natural thing that they are, if you like, the beneficiaries of our coaching work together. We're both in service of that, not I'm here for you to grow and meet your needs. And in the book, we do go through lots of ways you can start a relationship that way. So it becomes very natural because we are there in service of because it comes from a value base which says, unless they're in service of all their ecological niches, from the human to the more than human, ultimately they're not in service of themselves. Yeah. So that would be my first starting place. So I hopefully, Tabitha, that's given you some thinking time.
Well, it has, because I mean, what you're talking about there of eco-engaged is going further to partnering with nature as a coach. So instead, I mean, this is going into touching upon like biomimicry, and this is my favorite way to coach. What does the tree teach you about what needs to happen? How does the forest ecosystem show you how to resolve the challenges and the tension that you're experiencing within your organization? And being able to look at, you know, and I'm fascinated by trees and the forest ecosystem and the mycelium, because I think it's a great network systemic approach to bring in. And I talk, you know, I've the coaches that I work with take people on tree journeys, and we do tree mapping to map out businesses so that you can start building up that relationship, because fundamentally, ideally in the role of where does the evolution of coaching go, we want to be partnering with either the trees, the cats, the forest, and saying, what is the forest saying? How can we become translators to work on behalf of nature and earth so that you can come back into that state of wholeness and connection, and then you can go out, you know, and look deeper into nature, as Albert Einstein says, and then you'll understand things much better. And fundamentally, that is where I see our capacity as coaches to really be, to offer that in that partnership, that relationship, and almost in service to the natural world who doesn't speak English, but is communicating non-verbally all the time. And I think one of the most powerful things about us as coaches when we do our own work is that we then become tuned into the fine rhythms and tensions and flows that exist. And really, how can we shift into ways of coaching with our clients so that what we're actually saying is, the trees just moved there. What's the thought that emerges there? What's the dance and the relationship? How do the way that the leaves move inspire you to think differently about your organization? That's the nuance of being able to coach and partner with nature that we really want to be stepping into.
There's that lovely quote from Robin Moore Kimmerer, who wrote that beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass, where she said, we have to realize that we are the youngest child of creation. not the peak of creation, the youngest child. And we have to have the humility to learn from our elder brothers and sisters. I just love that notion. And as you know, Tabitha, because we talked about it on your podcast,
Yes.
that whole notion of how do we see ourselves at the ecology as, I wrote this blog, let the ecology do the coaching, not be an agenda item. Let the ecology be a partner in that we're learning from. And that notion of biomimicry, I love.
There's a very pertinent comment from Claire in the chat saying, I find clients often use metaphors from nature to describe situations and feelings. I found exploring those easiest way of beginning to bring the more than human world into coaching.
Rather mechanistic ones.
Linda.
Well, Tabitha, I'm coming on one of your events, please.
Well, I am talking about trees and how trees can help us catalyze positive change. Sorry, not doing a plug here, George, as part of the Climate Coaching Alliance, and we'll be talking about tree journeys and how we can go on trees and journeys with the trees.
So space is left unbooked. I mean, it just sounds amazing. Biomimicry and trees sounds wonderful. I think so you've talked both systemically and also metaphorically. So if I may, my contribution now will be perhaps more of a practical side that might be also as useful for people. I think for me, the first thing was to be really clear about what I wanted and didn't want to do anymore. And that meant having a re-examination of my values, which I always thought were quite strong, but this caused a revisitation of what's my role. It's the question that's been around for a while. What's mine to do, and why did I train as a coach? Why have I gone on the journey that I've gone? What's really important to me now? Because if what I'm doing isn't important to me now, how good can I be as a coach if I'm disingenuous in any way? If I've got a hidden agenda that I'm not bringing forward, then that's not good coaching either. So I think it was a re-examination of where do I want to coach and who and how. It was also being really transparent to the world, and as a former kind of psychotherapist, we're often quite secretive about who we are and what our values are and our lives are. We don't write about ourselves. And as a member of Extinction Rebellion and a speaker with Extinction Rebellion, one of our core asks really is that the media and the government tell the truth about what's going on. And I thought, well, if I'm not living that myself, then I can hardly claim to do this work with any integrity. So I posted on LinkedIn that I was working with Extinction Rebellion, and I pressed that button and I expected my world to collapse. And you know what? It didn't. I thought, I'd be outed as some kind of, but at that time it was a lot more rebellious act than it is now. So I think there's that stepping outside of what we might find comfortable, and as has already been talked about, perhaps redefining what the role of coaches is now in these current times. And then they're showing up, as I've mentioned. How do we show up before people even meet us? Because how we show up will impact the contract we have when we finally do meet them. And if they come along thinking we're going to be coaching them on how to grow their hair long, and we end up saying, well, let's think about the wider system in which your hair grows. I'm using a silly analogy really, but if that's what if they're coming for coaching on performance anxiety, and we suddenly talk about the wider system without any other context to it, it won't make sense, and it won't be what they've expected, and it won't be welcoming or invitational. So I think getting the system up front and clear as much as possible, and asking questions before we've even agreed to work with people. And I've just written about this in Coaching at Work, I'm in a position of choice where I can now say, this isn't the right work for me, but I can help you find someone else. But if more of us were being systemic in our conversations before we've even agreed to work together, if more of us were saying this is what we do and this is what we're concerned about, then the world of coaching would shift with us too. And so people would come along expecting that these are the kinds of things we're going to talk about, so that it becomes the norm rather than the exception. And just one final thing I want to add, just on a very personal note, people know me mostly as a time to think consultant who teaches completely non-directive ways of being. When I'm contracted to do time to think work, where I simply ask, what do you want to think about and what are your thoughts? That's what we do. That is what we do. But people can still see me, and we will meet before we start to work together. So I'm not. So they're aware of who I am and what I'm. Then they choose whether or not to have me as their non-directive Time to Think coach. So I think we need to look at the work we already do and how we align that or let go of some of that in order to do the work that needs to be done ahead.
Thanks, Linda.
George, before I go, first of all, thank you, Linda, for that. But there was a question from Lucy West, which before I leave, I feel I really want to respond to, which was,
yeah, go.
You must, yes.
Where she said, progressive organisations may take a stakeholder perspective, but many organisations don't. I think we need to be careful about that assumption. If I start from an assumption, of course, every organisation wants to be in service of its stakeholders, because if they're not, they don't have anything but a very short-term future. If we start from the assumption, of course, they want to work with their stakeholders, I never find an organisation that doesn't, right? And one of the ways it can help, if you do feel there's some resistance, is to help them think outside, to invite the outside in, and to invite the future back, which is to ask them, so what are you going to regret in 3 years' time not having focused on today in coaching? If your customers here, what would they say is the work we should be doing? Just naturally invite the stakeholders' voice into the room. I start all my coaching journeys with top teams in many different sectors and with individuals, many different countries. If I start there, and I think it's just as natural as anything else, I've never found an organization resist. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Peter. If there's something that's going to make you late, I'm glad it was that answer. So thank you so much for joining us in the contribution.
So thanks for having me, and thank you, Linda and Tabitha and George, because I really appreciate the great deal all three of you are doing in this whole world, and we all need to be doing more.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Go well.
And folks, as we come to our last couple of minutes and wrap up, the invitation is to share in the chat box what you'll be doing as a result of this, or what you'll not be doing as a result of this conversation. Coaching has its eye on action and progress. So what are you going to be doing as a result of this conversation? And while those chats come through, I guess, well, Tabitha, Linda, it'd be great to hear a final, something that you'd like to say by way of closing, and maybe an encouragement to our audience members.
So there's two things that I would like to say. I love the question that Grattan has posed there of asking the trees, what will it take to wake humanity up? I think that would be a wonderful co-creative conversation to have. But on a practical level, if we bring it back down to earth and tangible, somebody was asking about environmental policies. So it's finding ways to measure your carbon emissions and looking at what would make the most impact. I mean, Planet Mark is out there. There's other carbon accounting software, CBN Expert, for example, and being able to start there as a way allows you to start opening up greater possibilities, because you can go and you can look at a B Corporation assessment, but as a one-person coach, that can be too overwhelming as a starting point. But carbon emissions allow you to go, well, wait a minute, let me have a little look and make little tweaks environmentally that allow me to open up that greater awareness to think more systemically, knowing that carbon is really just that first step into a wider ecosystem of transformation and sustainability.
Thanks, Tabitha. And Linda, in a minute or less.
Yeah. Find a tribe or several tribes. Now is not a time to be alone. Collaboration is going to be key to all of the things we're doing, and collaboration in terms of how we work together, collaboration with our clients, collaboration with each other. The days of competition are they've been around for too long. Find ways to collaborate and be in a tribe and get some great supportive resources and colleagues like I have, that I could not have got through these last 3 years without some fabulous people.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you, Tabitha. Thank you, Vicky, for helping set this up. And thank you all for taking this hour. Really, really great to have you here. And I wish you all the very best going forth in this journey. It's a remarkable journey to go on. And yeah, what a real pleasure to have you all here.
Thank you, George. And thank you, Tabitha. And thank you, Vicky. And thank you, everybody, for being here and your fabulous questions.